The invitation arrived in a black-edged envelope, smelling of damp earth and pressed flowers. Elias Thorne, a struggling freelance photographer from London, hadn't spoken to his great-uncle Silas in 20 years. Now, Silas was dead, leaving Elias the sole heir to Blackwood Manor, a crumbling estate tucked away in the suffocatingly thick woods of Somerset. "It's a fresh start," his girlfriend, Sarah, had encouraged him as they drove down the narrow, winding lanes. "We can fix it up, sell it, and finally buy that studio you've wanted." But as the rusted iron gates of the manor groaned open, Elias felt a cold prickle of dread. The house didn't look like a home. It looked like a tombstone rising out of the tall, yellow grass. The village nearby, Oakhaven, was unnaturally quiet. The locals didn't wave. They simply stopped what they were doing and watched the car pass with eyes that seemed too wide, too pale. That evening, while Sarah was unpacking, Elias wandered into the overgrown backyard. In the center of a circle of dead oak trees stood a stone well. It was capped with a heavy wooden lid and bound by rusted iron chains that looked far newer than the stone itself. As Elias approached, the wind died down. The evening birds went silent. From the depths of the well, a sound drifted up. It wasn't the splash of water. It was a rhythmic, dry scraping, like fingernails on stone. Elias, he froze. The voice sounded like his mother's, but she had passed away when he was a child. It was a soft, wet whisper that seemed to vibrate inside his own skull. "Elias, open the gate. We are so thirsty." He reached for the heavy wooden lid, his hand moving as if in a trance. His fingers gripped the rough wood. The iron chains began to rattle violently, though there was no wind. "Elias, what are you doing?" Sarah's voice shattered the spell. Elias jumped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sun had dropped below the horizon, and the shadows of the trees looked like long, skeletal arms reaching for the well. "Nothing," Elias stammered, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just looking at the old well. It's probably dried up." "Come inside," Sarah said, shivering. "The air out here feels wrong, like it's been breathed before." As they walked back to the house, Elias glanced over his shoulder. In the twilight, he saw a pale, thin hand, too long to be human, grip the edge of the well from the inside, its fingers curling over the stone before sliding back into the dark. The inheritance wasn't just the house. It was what lived beneath it. The first night in Blackwood Manor was not silent. The house groaned as if the wood were settling over an old wound. Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thump, 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 coming from the pipes inside the walls. Beside him, Sarah slept fitfully, her brow creased in a frown. Driven by a restless curiosity, Elias got up and headed to Silas's study. The room was choked with the smell of old paper and copper. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and swollen with moisture. He opened it to the last entry, dated only 3 days before Silas's death. "The chains are thinning. The salt no longer holds a seal. They are screaming for the tithe, and I have no more to give. If the thorn line ends, the well will overflow. God help the one who inherits this thirst." "The thirst," Elias whispered to himself. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the master bathroom. Elias sprinted down the hall. He found Sarah standing by the clawfoot bathtub, her face white with terror. She had tried to run a bath, but the tub wasn't filled with clear water. A thick, viscous black liquid, smelling of stagnant ponds and old blood, was pulsing out of the faucet. It didn't flow like water. It moved like a living thing, coiling and swirling in the basin. "It won't stop, Elle. I turned the handle, but it won't stop." Sarah cried. Elias grabbed the iron handle and twisted it with all his might. The pipes shrieked, a sound that modulated into a high-pitched, human-like wail, before the flow finally choked out. He looked down at the black sludge. In the center of the tub, the liquid began to form a shape. A face, hollow-eyed and skeletal, rose briefly to the surface before dissolving back into the muck. "We have to leave. Now," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I don't care about the money or the house. There's something rotting under this land. It's just old plumbing, Sarah. Probably a collapsed septic line. Elias lied, though his own hands were shaking. He walked to the window and looked out toward the garden. In the moonlight, the stone well stood like a silent sentinel. The heavy wooden lid was no longer flat. It was tilted, as if something from below had been pushing against it all night. And then he saw them. Small, pale figures were standing at the edge of the woods. They weren't moving. They were just watching the house. They looked like children, but their limbs were elongated, and they wore tattered clothes from a century ago. "Sarah, don't look out the window," Elias whispered. But it was too late. One of the figures raised a thin, gray arm and pointed directly at the bathroom window. Suddenly, every faucet in the house, the kitchen, the laundry room, the basement shook violently. The sound of rushing, black water filled the house, and the floorboards beneath their feet began to feel damp. The thirst had found a way inside. Elias didn't wait for the black water to reach their ankles. He grabbed Sarah's hand, snatched the car keys from the counter, and bolted for the front door. They didn't pack. They didn't look back. The car engine roared to life, a discordant scream against the heavy silence of the estate. Elias slammed the gear into reverse, spinning the tires on the wet gravel. As the headlights swept across the garden, for a split second, they illuminated the well. The heavy iron chains were gone, snapped like brittle thread. "Drive, Elias. Just drive," Sarah yelled, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Behind them, the front door of Blackwood Manor stood wide open, and a slow, dark tide of black liquid began to pour out of the threshold, spilling down the stone steps like ink. They reached the main road that led to the village of Oakhaven. But as they drove, the fog rolled in, thick, yellow, and smelling of sulfur. Elias slowed down, squinting through the windshield. "Where's the turn?" he muttered. "The crossroads should be right here." The road didn't turn. It didn't end. It simply became a loop. Every time they drove past a jagged, lightning-struck oak tree, they would find themselves passing the same tree again 3 minutes later. The forest was closing in, the branches interlacing above them like the ribs of a giant cage. Suddenly, the car's headlights died. The engine sputtered and choked, as if the fuel had turned to lead. "No, no, no, not now." Elias hammered on the steering wheel. Silence swallowed them. Then a soft tap, 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 sounded on the roof of the car. Sarah looked up. Through the glass sunroof, she saw a face. It was one of the pale figures from the woods, a boy, no older than 10, but his skin was translucent and his eyes were entirely black, leaking a dark fluid. He wasn't sitting on the car. He was crouching, his long fingers leaving wet, muddy streaks on the glass. "Open," the boy whispered, his voice echoing through the car speakers. "We are so dry. Elias, do something." Sarah screamed. Elias grabbed a heavy flashlight from the glove box and stepped out of the car, desperate to scare the creature away. But as he stood on the road, he realized the road was gone. Beneath his boots wasn't asphalt, but soft, graveyard soil. The car was sitting in the middle of a clearing, and surrounding them were dozens of the pale, thin villagers. They weren't attacking. They were kneeling. A tall man in a tattered priest's collar stepped forward. His skin was like wrinkled parchment, and his tongue flickered out to lick his bone-dry lips. "The thorn has returned," the priest croaked. "The well is empty, and the earth is screaming. You brought the vessel with you." He pointed a shaking finger at Sarah, who was still cowering inside the car. "Leave her alone," Elias shouted, swinging the flashlight. "You don't understand, boy," the priest said, a hollow laugh rattling in his chest. Silas kept the well full with his own blood for 20 years. But he ran out. The well doesn't want water. It wants a life that is loved. To save the village, the well must drink. The ground began to vibrate. From the direction of the manor, a low, tectonic roar echoed. The black water wasn't just in the pipes anymore. It was rising from the soil itself. Elias lunged for the car door, but the villagers were faster. They didn't move with anger. They moved with a terrifying, mechanical desperation. Their hands, cold and dry as autumn leaves, pulled Elias away while others shattered the car window to reach Sarah. "Don't hurt her," Elias roared, struggling against the grip of 4 men whose strength defied their frail appearances. "Hurt her," the priest whispered, leaning close. His breath smelled of salt and stagnant water. "No, boy. We are going to make her eternal." They were dragged through the woods, not to a house, but to the Oakhaven Chapel, a lopsided structure of gray stone and moss. Inside, the pews had been removed. In their place, hundreds of clay bowls were lined up on the floor, all of them bone-dry. The priest, whose name was Father Miller, forced Elias to sit in the front row. Sarah was tied to a stone pillar at the altar, her eyes wide with a frantic, silent plea. "Look at the walls," Thorne, Miller commanded. Elias looked. The murals weren't of saints. They depicted a great drought from the 1600s. People were shown turning to dust, the earth cracking open. In the center of the mural was a man, the first Thorne, kneeling before a dark hole in the ground. He was offering a heart. "Your ancestor made a deal with the Deep Ones," Miller explained, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "In exchange for never-ending water for our crops, the Thorne family promised to keep the well moist with a soul once every generation." Silas failed. He grew old and weak. He tried to trick the well with animal blood, but the Deep Ones know the difference. Suddenly, the floor of the church began to seep. The black liquid they had seen at the Manor started bubbling up between the floorboards. "It's coming!" A woman in the back screamed, her voice cracking with thirst. The villagers rushed forward, not to flee, but to kneel and lick the black sludge from the floor. As they drank, their skin began to turn gray, and their veins turned black. They weren't just drinking water, they were becoming part of the hive. "If we don't give the well what it wants tonight," Miller said, his eyes turning entirely black, "the black water will overflow and drown every town for 50 miles. Oakhaven will be the epicenter of a Dead Sea." He pulled out a silver ritual dagger. The handle was carved from a human humerus bone. "The well wants the thing the Thorne loves most," Miller said, turning towards Sarah. "That is the law of the pact." Elias realized then that his inheritance wasn't just a house or a curse. He was the executioner. The priest didn't have the power to finish the ritual. Only a Thorne could offer the sacrifice. "I won't do it," Elias hissed, his voice trembling. "Then the water will take us all," Miller replied, "starting with you." From the shadows behind the altar, a massive, bloated shape began to rise. It looked like a human made of wet mud and rotting seaweed, its face a featureless void of darkness. It was the guardian of the well, and it was hungry. The bloated guardian moved with a sickening, liquid sound, its footsteps leaving puddles of black ichor on the consecrated stone. Father Miller handed the silver dagger to Elias, his grip like a vice. "Do it, Thorne, before the Deep One claims us all." Elias looked at the dagger, then at Sarah. Her tears were the only clear liquid left in this godforsaken place. But as his fingers closed around the bone handle, he felt a sharp vibration. A hidden compartment in the hilt clicked open, revealing a tiny, rolled-up piece of parchment. It was a note from Silas, written in a frantic, dying hand. "The well doesn't want a soul. It wants the Thorne bloodline to end. The pact is a lie told by the villagers to keep themselves immortal. Strike the stone, not the heart." Elias's eyes widened. He realized the villagers weren't victims, they were parasites. They had used the Thorne family for centuries to maintain their own unnatural lives, feeding the well so they would never age, never die, and never leave. "The pact ends tonight," Elias screamed. Instead of turning the blade towards Sarah, Elias lunged at Father Miller. But the priest's skin was as tough as tan leather. The blade skipped off his shoulder, drawing a line of that thick, black sludge instead of red blood. "Blasphemy!" Miller shrieked, his jaw widening to an impossible size. Suddenly, the church bells began to ring on their own, a frantic, clanging alarm. The floor didn't just seep, it exploded. A geyser of black water erupted in the center of the aisle, tossing villagers aside like ragdolls. From the geyser, a ghostly figure emerged. It was Silas Thorne. His spirit was gray and translucent, wrapped in the very chains that had once bound the well. "You were always a fool, Miller," the ghost of Silas roared, his voice sounding like rushing rapids. I didn't die of a weak heart. I drowned myself in the well to poison the source. The ghost of Silas turned to Elias. Run, boy. The water is no longer pure. My death has turned the well into a tomb. If you stay, you become part of the rot. The guardian of the well let out a roar of agony. The black water touching Silas's ghost began to turn a fiery, glowing white. The two forces, the ancient curse and the poisoned spirit, clashed, creating a vortex of energy that began to pull the stone walls of the church inward. Elias, the ropes. Sarah screamed. Elias slashed through Sarah's bindings just as the altar began to sink into the liquefying floor. The villagers, now driven by a mindless, primal thirst, crawled toward the black geyser, trying to drink the corrupted fluid even as it dissolved their flesh. We have to go to the basement, Elias shouted, grabbing Sarah. Silas's note said the stone, the foundation stone of the church, is connected to the well's throat. They dived through a small wooden door behind the pulpit, spiraling down into the dark, damp foundations of the chapel. Behind them, the screams of the villagers were drowned out by the sound of the church collapsing into the earth. The basement of the chapel was not a cellar. It was a cavern. The walls were made of slick, black obsidian that seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. As Elias and Sarah descended, the temperature dropped until their breath came out in jagged shards of ice. In the center of the cavern lay a massive, circular hole, the throat. It was the true source of the well, a direct vein into the dark heart of the earth. The black water here wasn't rushing. It was vibrating, humming a low frequency that made Elias's teeth ache as vision blurred. "Elle, look at the floor," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The ground was littered with bones. Thousands of them. They weren't just animal bones. There were small skulls, wedding rings, and rusted pocket watches. The Thorne family had been feeding this hole for centuries, and Oakhaven had grown fat on the sacrifice. "We have to stop the flow," Elias said, his eyes fixed on the foundation stone. A massive white quartz monolith etched with ancient, bleeding runes that sat directly over the lip of the abyss. Suddenly, the black water in the pit began to rise, forming a towering column. It didn't take a human shape this time. It became a mass of crushing tentacles and lidless eyes, the true Deep One. It was a primordial deity of thirst, an entity that had existed before the first drop of rain ever fell on Earth. Thorne, the entity boomed, the sound vibrating through their very marrow. "The debt is overdue. Give me the vessel, and you shall rule the silent seas." "I'm not giving you anything," Elias shouted, raising the silver dagger. The entity lashed out with a whip of black water. Elias ducked, the fluid sizzling as it hit the stone wall behind him like acid. "The runes, Elias." Sarah pointed to the foundation stone. Silas's note said to strike the stone. "The runes are what keep the gate open." Elias scrambled toward the monolith, but the ground beneath him turned into a slick, oily marsh. Every step felt like walking through waist-deep tar. The Deep One sensed his intent and let out a piercing shriek that shattered the remaining clay bowls in the cavern. A tentacle of shadow wrapped around Sarah's waist, lifting her high above the pit. "Elias, do it. Don't worry about me," she screamed. Elias looked at the stone. The runes were glowing with a sickly green light. He realized that the silver dagger wasn't meant to kill a person. It was a key. The bone handle was the perfect shape to fit into a central notch in the quartz. But as he reached the stone, Father Miller appeared from the shadows of the cavern, his body half dissolved by the corrupted water, his face a melting mask of madness. "You'll kill us all, boy," Miller croaked, lunged at Elias with a jagged piece of wood. Without the well, the village turns to dust in seconds. "We are the water. The water is us." Elias had a choice. Save the woman he loved by completing the sacrifice, or destroy the stone and risk drowning in the collapse of the entire cave system. The cavern shook as the Deep One tightened its grip on Sarah. Her ribs groaned under the pressure of the shadow tentacle, and her face began to turn a terrifying shade of blue. "Drop the knife, Thorne!" Father Miller screamed, lunging at Elias. The priest was no longer human. His skin had translucent patches where the black water had eaten through his flesh, revealing charcoal-colored bone. Elias rolled across the slick obsidian floor, narrowly avoiding Miller's jagged wooden stake. He scrambled toward the foundation stone, but Miller was faster, tackling him into the shallow, oily water. "You think you're a hero?" Miller spat, his breath smelling of ancient rot. "You're just another lamb for the slaughter. Your family has been the village's lifeblood for 400 years. We won't let you turn off the tap." Miller's hands wrapped around Elias's throat. As the air left Elias's lungs, his vision began to fade into a mosaic of white sparks. In that moment of near death, he heard Silas's voice again. Not a whisper this time, but a roar of command. "The blood is the conduit, Elias. Use the source." Elias realized that the silver dagger wasn't just a key, it was a bridge. He didn't need to stab Miller. He slammed the bone hilt of the dagger into his own palm, slicing deep, as his blood, the fresh, warm blood of a thorn, hit the silver blade. The dagger began to glow with a blinding, golden light. It was the first pure thing to enter this cavern in centuries. The Deep One shrieked in agony. The golden light acted like acid on the black water, causing the entity to recoil and drop Sarah. She plummeted toward the obsidian floor, but Elias managed to kick Miller off him and catch her just in time. "The stone, Sarah, now!" Elias staggered toward the foundation stone. Father Miller tried to rise, but as the golden light from the dagger touched his corrupted skin, he began to dissolve into gray ash, his screams echoing off the cavern walls until he was nothing but a memory of dust. Elias reached the monolith. The runes were pulsing violently, trying to fight back against the intruder. He saw the central notch, a small, star-shaped indentation in the quartz. He didn't hesitate. He jammed the silver dagger, still coated in his glowing blood, into the notch. The sound that followed was not an explosion. It was the sound of a world-shattering snap. The white quartz monolith cracked from top to bottom. The green runes flickered and died, replaced by a searing white fire that raced down into the throat. The Deep One let out a final, earth-shaking roar as the golden light tore through its liquid body, evaporating the black water into a thick, harmless mist. "It's over," Sarah gasped, clutching Elias's arm. But the cavern was failing. Without the power of the Deep One to hold the ancient stone together, the obsidian walls began to crumble. Boulders the size of cars crashed into the abyss. "We have to climb," Elias shouted, pointing to the winding stone staircase that led back to the surface. As they ran, Elias looked back one last time. He saw the village of Oakhaven above them, or what was left of it, without the magical water to sustain them. The houses were collapsing into piles of dry rot, and the very ground was turning into a desert of shifting sand. The pact was broken, but the price of freedom was the destruction of everything that had been built upon the line. Elias and Sarah burst through the basement door just as the Oakhaven chapel imploded behind them. A massive cloud of gray dust and ancient incense billowed into the air. The sound was like a mountain collapsing, a heavy, final thud that shook the very roots of the forest. When the dust settled, the moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting a cold, silver light on a scene of total devastation. The village was gone. It wasn't just destroyed, it was decayed. Without the Deep One's black water to unnaturally preserve the wood and stone, centuries of rot had caught up to Oakhaven in a single minute. The houses had slumped into piles of gray timber. The lush, green trees had turned into brittle, skeletal husks that snapped in the wind. "The people," Sarah whispered her, voice trembling. The villagers were no longer screaming. They lay scattered across the road like discarded dolls. Their skin had turned to fine, white ash, and their clothes were nothing more than tattered rags. They hadn't died just now. They had been dead for a long time, held together only by the thirst. "Don't look, Sarah. Just keep moving," Elias said, his hands still bleeding from the ritual cut. They stumbled toward where they had left the car, but the road was now a river of sand. The car was half buried, its metal rusted through as if it had sat there for 50 years instead of 5 hours. Suddenly, the wind shifted. A low, dry whistling sound filled the air. It sounded like 1,000 parched throats trying to swallow at once. Thorne! 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 The dust on the ground began to swirl, forming a small, localized cyclone. From the center of the dust, a face began to take shape, the face of the boy from the car roof. But now his features were made entirely of dry sand and grit. We are still so dry. The dust voice rasped. The entity hadn't died when the water evaporated. It had simply changed its state. The thirst was now a creature of the wind and the desert. It's following us, Sarah cried, shielding her eyes from the stinging grit. The cyclone lunged forward, stripping the remaining paint off the rusted car. It wasn't trying to drown them anymore. It was trying to dehydrate them. Elias felt the moisture leaving his throat. His tongue felt like a piece of dry leather, and his eyes began to burn. The dagger. Sarah shouted, "You still have it." Elias looked at his hand. The silver dagger was no longer glowing. Its light had been spent breaking the stone, but the blood on the blade was still wet. It wants life, Elias realized. He didn't run. He turned toward the dust spirit and held out his bleeding hand. "You want the blood of a thorn? Take it, but take it all." He flicked the blood into the heart of the cyclone. As the droplets hit the dust, they didn't soak in. They expanded, turning into a searing, red mist. The thorn blood was a poison to the entity now that the covenant was broken. It was a gift of life that the spirit of death could no longer digest. The cyclone shrieked, a dry, rattling sound, and collapsed into a harmless pile of sand. "Let's go," Elias gasped, his voice a mere whisper, before it find a way to reform. They began the long trek out of the woods on foot. But as they reached the edge of the estate, Elias felt a strange heaviness in his pocket. He reached in and pulled out a single, smooth stone from the well. It was pulsing with a faint, rhythmic heartbeat. The sun began to rise, but it wasn't the warm, golden dawn Elias had hoped for. It was a harsh, white glare that seemed to suck the moisture out of the air. They had reached the main highway, their clothes tattered and their skin coated in the gray ash of Oak Haven. A car. "Oh, look!" Sarah waved her arms frantically at a passing transport truck. The truck screeched to a halt. The driver, a burly man with a kind face, looked at them with pure confusion. "Good Lord, did you two crawl out a landslide? Get in, I've got water in the back." At the mention of the word water, Elias's stomach did a violent somersault. He didn't feel thirsty. He felt an overwhelming, nauseating aversion to it. They climbed into the cab. Sarah grabbed a plastic bottle and gulped the water down, but when she handed it to Elias, he recoiled as if she were holding a snake. You're bone dry. You need to drink," Sarah said, her voice laced with concern. I can't," Elias rasped. His voice sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. He looked down at his hand. The cut from the ritual wasn't healing. Instead of a scab, the edges of the wound were turning white and crystalline. He touched it, and a flake of pure salt fell onto his lap. "The stone," Elias whispered, remembering the pebble in his pocket. He pulled it out. The stone was no longer gray. It was a translucent, pulsating amber. It wasn't just a rock, it was a seed. By breaking the foundation stone, Elias hadn't just ended the curse. He had absorbed the essence of the vacuum. He was becoming the new well. "Stop the truck," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "What? We're only 10 miles from the hospital," the driver said. "Stop the truck," Elias roared. As he shouted, the air inside the cab became impossibly dry. The driver began to cough, his skin visibly wrinkling as if the humidity was being sucked out of his pores. The plastic water bottle in Sarah's hand suddenly shriveled, the liquid inside vanishing into thin air. "Elias, stop. You're hurting him." Sarah screamed, clutching her throat. Elias saw his reflection in the truck side mirror. His eyes were no longer brown. They were the color of sun-bleached bone. His skin was tightening over his skull, turning into a pale, leathery parchment. He scrambled out of the truck and collapsed onto the hot asphalt of the highway. Sarah ran to him, but she stopped a few feet away. The heat radiating off Elias was so intense it was warping the air. "Don't come near me, Sarah." Elias groaned, his body convulsing. The thorn line, it doesn't end. It just changes shape. He looked at the horizon. In the distance, he could see a small town. He could feel the water in their pipes, the moisture in their lungs, the blood in their veins. To the thirst now living inside him, the world looked like a vast, untapped ocean. The deep one, it didn't die, Elias realized, his fingers digging into the asphalt, leaving white, salty streaks. It just found a vessel that can move. The stone in his hand began to glow with a fierce, hungry light. Elias felt a sudden, terrifying urge to run. Not away from the town, but toward it. The highway shimmered in the heat. Elias stood in the center of the road, a skeletal figure wrapped in a shroud of swirling salt and dust. Every breath he took felt like a vacuum, pulling the moisture from the grass at the roadside, turning the green blades into brittle needles of straw. "Elias, please, fight it," Sarah cried, standing 10 feet away, her skin cracking in the unnatural aridity he radiated. "I can't. Sarah." It's not a voice anymore, Elias gasped, his joints snapping like dry twigs as he moved. It's a hunger, a global thirst. He looked at his hands. They were no longer flesh. They were translucent, crystalline structures. He could feel the pulse of the town 5 miles away. The water towers, the reservoirs, the very moisture in the clouds. If he reached the town, he wouldn't just drink. He would become a black hole for all life. The amber stone in his palm fused with his skin, becoming a glowing eye in the center of his hand. "Feed me," the world seemed to hum. Elias looked at Sarah. He saw the water in her eyes, her tears. The monster inside him surged, wanting to reach out and snuff out her life just to dampen its parched throat for a second. "I won't let you have them," Elias whispered. He remembered Silas's final act. Silas had drowned himself to poison the source. But Silas had used water. Elias realized he had something more powerful, the thorn will. "Sarah, take the dagger." Elias threw the silver blade toward her. It skittered across the hot asphalt, stopping at her feet. "The stone in my hand, it's the heart. You have to strike it. Now." "No, Elias, I can't kill you." "You're not killing me," Elias roared, his voice now a chorus of 1,000 dry winds. "I died in that cavern. This is just the shell. If you don't do it, the world will turn to dust. Do it." The entity inside Elias sensed the danger. It forced his arm up, aiming a blast of dehydrating energy at Sarah. Sarah dived for the dagger. As the air around her turned into a furnace, she lunged forward, not with hatred, but with a sob of pure grief. She drove the silver blade directly into the amber stone embedded in Elias's palm. The world went white. A massive shock wave of energy erupted from the point of contact. But it wasn't a blast of fire, it was a deluge. The thirst that Elias had absorbed, the centuries of stolen moisture, and the primordial power of the deep one suddenly inverted. The vacuum became a fountain. Thousands of gallons of crystal clear, cold water exploded from Elias's body. It flooded the highway, drenching the dry fields, turning the dusty road into a rushing river. Sarah was swept back by the force of the flood. She tumbled through the water, gasping as the cool liquid filled her lungs, healing her cracked skin instantly. When the water finally settled into a calm, shallow pool on the road, the heat was gone. The air was sweet and humid. Sarah stood up, dripping wet, and looked for Elias. He was gone. In the middle of the road, where he had stood, was a small, beautiful spring bubbling up from a crack in the asphalt. The water was pure, sweet, and life-giving. Beside the spring lay the silver dagger and a small pile of white sand. The thorn line had finally paid its debt, not with a sacrifice of blood, but with a gift of life. Epilogue. Months later, the town near the highway became famous. A natural spring had appeared out of nowhere, and its water was said to heal the sick and bring rain to the driest droughts. Sarah moved far away, but she kept a small vial of that water around her neck. Sometimes, when the room is very quiet, she holds the vial to her ear. She doesn't hear a whisper of thirst or a cry of hunger. She hears the sound of a distant, peaceful rain. And in the ruins of Oakhaven, where the well once stood, a single, green oak tree has begun to grow out of the sand. The first living thing in 400 years that doesn't need a soul to survive.